Welcome to our deep dive. We've got a fascinating set of texts this time around. They really make you think about race and religion, and how a scientific thought kind of gets mixed up in all of that. It's complex stuff.
Yeah, it is. And, it's interesting because there's this common idea out there. A lot of folks think that the Catholic Church basically came up with the idea that Black people lacked souls.
Right, and we're going to get into that.
Yeah,
But you've been looking through these sources, right? Academic excerpts, historical accounts, even some pretty strong quotes that might raise some eyebrows.
absolutely. Yeah,
Huh.
we can see if that whole church thing holds up.
Okay, so one of the sources talks about these early Black Christians. We're talking about people like Simon the Niger from the Book of Acts, the Ethiopian eunuch. I mean, these figures were part of the faith centuries before the transatlantic slave trade even started. What do you make of that?
I think it really challenges that simple narrative that a lot of people have,
Yeah.
about European Christianity encountering Africa as this pagan land. And it raises some interesting questions like, did you know that Christianity was actually thriving in Africa, especially in Ethiopia, way before many European countries even adopted the religion?
Wow, I had no idea, really. That's amazing. I mean, so while England was still, all about their pagan beliefs, you're saying there were these established Christian communities already in Africa.
Exactly. And that alone, that fact, it makes the whole idea that the Catholic Church universally denied souls to Black people, it makes that idea much more complicated. It makes you really question the historical accuracy of that claim.
Yeah, I mean, and there's more, right? Like, what about the veneration of Black saints? We have figures like Saints Perpetua and Felicity,
Yeah.
martyred in the early 3rd century. Their story, I mean, it was well known. So if the church believed Black people didn't have souls, how could they become saints? How does that work?
It's a great question. And to understand this, we have to really dig deeper into what Catholic doctrine actually says about the soul. Key figures like Augustine and Aquinas, central to Catholic theology, they argued that the soul isn't something you get based on your race or your social status,
Okay.
you know?
So how did they define the soul then?
Well, they use this concept of corpore et anima unus, which means one in body and soul. It's this idea that there's a universal human essence that goes beyond just physical traits.
Hmm.
So all humans, regardless of their race, are seen as this unified being, body and soul together.
So if we apply that concept to how the church actually acted historically, what do we see?
Well, the church baptized enslaved people,
Right.
and that wasn't just some symbolic act.
Right.
Baptism meant you were recognizing someone as a person with a soul, a soul that could be saved. So this practice, it really contradicts the idea that the church was just teaching everyone that Black people didn't have souls.
Okay, that's a pretty strong point against that initial claim. But what about the church's official stance on slavery itself? I mean, what did they say about that?
The sources we have actually highlight a number of papal bulls, and pronouncements that directly condemned the practice of slavery.
Oh, wow. Can you give some examples?
Yeah.
Mm.
In 1435, Pope Eugene IV, he issued the bull Sicut Dudum, which demanded freedom for slaves in the Canary Islands.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the 15th century, you have Pope Pius II, who told bishops, you got to preach against enslaving Black people.
Wow. That's pretty
Yeah.
direct.
Yeah.
And what about later on? Did the stance change at all?
No, not really. Pope Pius VII, he even protested to Napoleon when Napoleon brought back the slave trade. So these pronouncements, I think, make it pretty clear that the church considered slavery to be morally wrong,
Hmm.
straight up.
And there's also that Golden Rose thing, right? Isn't that a big deal?
Oh, yeah. The Golden Rose, that's a significant award given out by the Pope. And Pope Leo XIII awarded the Golden Rose to Princess Isabel of Brazil for abolishing slavery in the late 19th century.
Okay, so you've got these actions, you've got the creation of churches specifically for Black communities, like the Brotherhood of Black Men in Sao Paulo. I mean, it really challenges that narrative that we started with.
I think so. It seems like this whole idea of the Catholic Church being the only source of this belief that Black people lack souls, it's more complicated than people might think. It's not as simple as it seems at first glance.
So if the church wasn't the only one spreading this idea, where did it come from? What do our sources say about that?
Well, while the church was busy condemning slavery, a very different perspective was starting to emerge in Europe, especially during the Enlightenment. And this is where things take kind of a dark turn. This is where we see the rise of what's called scientific racism.
Oh, that sounds ominous. And I see some big names associated with the Enlightenment here, people like Voltaire and Montesquieu.
Yeah. Yeah. And these are some of the figures whose views on race might really surprise you.
Okay, this is where things get really interesting and maybe a little uncomfortable. So, listeners, buckle up. We're about to dive into some pretty jarring quotes and ideas coming up in part 2 of our deep dive.
So let's start with Montesquieu. He's considered one of the most important thinkers in political thought. But get this, he actually believed that God wouldn't put a good soul in a completely black body.
Wow. I mean, that's a pretty shocking statement, especially coming from someone with his reputation. It seems like even some of the most celebrated intellectuals of that time held some pretty deep prejudices.
Yeah, and it wasn't just Montesquieu. Voltaire, the champion of free speech, religious tolerance, he also had some troubling views on race.
What kind of views are we talking about here?
Well, he went so far as to suggest that different human species existed. And guess what? Black people were placed lower on this hierarchy. He even used dehumanizing language, calling them animals, monstrous.
Yeah.
It's a pretty jarring contrast to the values he's usually associated with.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that even people who champion progressive ideals can be, well, blind to certain forms of injustice. And what's really unsettling is how this prejudice got mixed up with science during the Enlightenment.
Right. You have thinkers like John Ray and Edward Tyson who tried to classify different races based on physical characteristics. And they created this hierarchy with Europaeus albus at the top, A for Niger at the bottom. This basically laid the groundwork for what we call scientific racism, using scientific methods to justify racial bias.
So they were basically using science to reinforce existing prejudices.
Yeah, exactly. And the evidence they used, it was often very questionable. For example, Johann Reckel, a German surgeon, he claimed that black people had darker brains, suggesting a link between skin color and intelligence.
I mean, that sounds completely ridiculous now.
It is. But these ideas, they took hold. They influenced how people thought about race for generations. Another example, craniometry, the study of skull measurements. People like Dixon, they used craniometry to create racial categories, to support their beliefs about intelligence.
Craniometry. So they were judging intelligence based on the shape of someone's skull.
Pretty much, yeah. And this scientific approach, it was used to justify all sorts of discriminatory policies and practices. It's a disturbing example of how scientific methods can be distorted, to serve prejudiced agendas.
It's really a paradox. The Enlightenment, this period known for reason and progress, also gave rise to some of the most insidious forms of racism.
It makes you wonder, right? How could a movement that promoted individual liberty and human rights be so blind to the injustice of racial discrimination? It's a challenge. We need to look beyond the simple narratives and acknowledge the complexities and contradictions, even within movements that seem progressive.
Yeah. And our sources, they also reveal some surprising information about Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Not exactly who you'd expect to find in a conversation about race.
Yeah, it is surprising. They're known for their critiques of capitalism, their advocacy for social equality. But Marx and Engels, they express some views on race that actually align with the prejudices of their time.
That seems contradictory to their whole philosophy. What were their specific views?
Well, Engels believed in the superiority of the white race, and Marx himself, he made statements that suggested he accepted slavery as an economic necessity. He said, without slavery, there would be no cotton. Without cotton, there would be no modern industry.
That almost implies a willingness to overlook the human cost of such a brutal system. It's hard to reconcile those views with their image as champions of social justice.
It is, yeah. It might be jarring for people who associate Marx and Engels solely with the fight for equality. But it highlights the fact that even individuals who challenge power structures, they can still hold deeply flawed beliefs.
So we started this deep dive looking at the claim that the Catholic Church was the main source of this idea that Black people lacked souls. And while some clergy were involved in the slave trade, our sources haven't shown that the church as an institution, officially taught this.
It seems that the Enlightenment, with its focus on reason, actually played a big role in establishing and justifying racial hierarchies through this scientific racism.
And even those who advocated for social equality, like Marx and Engels, weren't immune to the racism of the 19th century. This is a complicated story.
Yeah. And this historical context, it's crucial for understanding how these ideas have shaped our world.